It's so important to incentivize what's going on in states and cities and companies. We had it with Dan Riker. Where's Dan? Is he here somewhere? We put together a little program a while ago, and we had different states come and tell what they're doing. I put together a little brochure afterwards. There'll be an equal number of blue and red states, and there's a lot going on. Innovation, different, and you can learn from that. Not only can other states learn from it, but the federal government can learn from it. It's the sort of the Brandeis role of experimenting in states. So that has been happening and can continue to happen and should be encouraged. So that's number one. Number two, I am tremendously impressed with what's coming out of our great researcher universities. We have our group at Stanford, Sally Benson. I saw she's around here somewhere, Sally. She does a wonderful job of pulling all the stuff together around Stanford. It's impressive. I have the privilege of chairing the MIT Energy Advisory Committee, so I see what those guys are doing. And what's happening is tremendous. I feel quite confident in listening to what's going on. We will very soon have the capacity for large-scale storage of electricity. That is a big deal. It takes the intermittency problem away from wind and solar. It also makes a big contribution to national security, because we all know how vulnerable our grid is to cyber attack or something. If you have a little storage, you have a little time to get yourself rearranged. And so this is a huge potential development. At any rate, I think the R&D effort deserves real support. And it's not that big a deal when it comes to money. You can't even find it in the rounding error of the federal budget. And Sally, you remember, we went to Washington, and we were set up with the Republicans on the House Energy Committee. These are supposed to be the bad guys, right? Selling them energy R&D was an absolute piece of cake. No problem. As soon as somebody says, okay, you got a good idea, the government will go into business and create a business doing this, you lose everybody. And you lose the support for energy R&D. So be smart. Keep the government out of business. It doesn't belong there anyway. As Larry Summers says, the government has no good track record of being a venture capitalist. That's not their thing. So let's support the energy R&D and let the commercial enterprises take over. And I think it's natural, because I notice here and at MIT, the funding that we have, I'm not mistaken, Sally, it's about 3-to-1, private versus government. In other words, private people see something serious, and they want to know what's going on, and they want to contribute. And we shouldn't be nervous about that. A lot of universities go crazy if there's a business around. At Stanford, we figured, what the hell, Silicon Valley, just a big Stanford spin-off. We know these guys. And MIT was founded on the principle of business and universities acting together. So if something good comes along, these are the people who know how to commercialize it, who know how to scale it. That's good. It makes it part of the thing. So I think this support for energy R&D is an essential ingredient, and it's working. And it needs to be enhanced and worked with, because we're creating the future. Now, I also asked myself, I was the director of the Office of Management and Budget when President Nixon signed the legislation that created the EPA. So when a new agency is created, it doesn't exist. And it gets space and people from other agencies, and if nobody's representing you, you will get the dogs. So the OMB is the representative. So in a sense, I was the first director of EPA. We put the pieces together. And one of the things that struck me about it was all the young, bright people that I'd known in an earlier thing I'd done came and they say, how do I get to work for the EPA? Because there's so much low-hanging fruit, and it's very juicy, and they wanted to come into it. So I think the young people will work their tails off on this, and they're very enthusiastic, and it can be put together. I might say one of the things that they emphasized then, and it's been brought home to me fully here, is how much you can do by just the way you behave. The low-hanging fruit is saving energy. What's the least expensive energy? The energy you don't use. What's the cleanest energy? The energy you don't use. What's the most secure energy? The energy you don't use. I see Jim Sweeney sitting over here. Jim is about to publish a book that has stunning results in it about the importance of energy efficiency. Interestingly, the lynch point in his graphs is all 1973. I remember 1973 vividly because I was Secretary of Treasury at the time. We had the Arab oil boycott because we resupplied Israel, and it's the war going on. And it was a traumatic event. Christmas lights discouraged, gas stations closed on weekends. It made a deep impression. So we got to look for other things that make an impression. And I think, personally, as an economist, I guess you'd have to say, I believe in the price system. So if carbon is a problem, let's put a price on it. So I have long advocated a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Revenue neutral, so it doesn't present any fiscal no drag on the economy. And nobody can say you're generating money for somebody to use for this or that or the other. It's just there to level the playing field. Because you want sources of energy to compete equally and to bear the cost of what they produce. And if there's a form of energy that produces a lot of carbon, that should be paying for that. I noticed this is I wrote a piece a long time ago on this, but it's gradually taking hold. There is an example in British Columbia that I think it's fair to say is working, although its scale is small. But more and more businesses are putting into their long-term investment plans the assumption that somehow they're going to have to regard carbon as having a price on it. I've noticed that the World Bank and the IMF have jointly come out advocating a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Anyway, I think a tax on what the problem is a good way to go. And I sell it to my conservative brethren by saying, well, you don't like the government telling you to do this, do that, don't do this. Okay, let's get rid of all that and just put a price out there and let people compete in terms of that price. And so that can do the job. So the energy R&D is really important. What's been already happening in states, I think there's a lot that can be learned looking from one state to another. And the federal government can learn from that. But don't sell private industry short. Steve is here as chairman of the Stanford trustees, and not too far from here is a power plant that Stanford has built. That is a fantastic plant. Very little carbon footprint to it. It has a way of combining solar with other ways of producing energy. It's classic. And this is done by a private university. So you can do these things, and they're doable, so let's let that multiply. Now, one final thing. I think it's fair to say that people realize that the Montreal Protocol was the one big international environmental treaty that worked. So let's take a look at how that happened. I was Secretary of State at the time, and we have, in the State Department, there was a group that worried about such things. And so we understood that there were a lot of scientists who thought the ozone layer was depleting. There were perfectly credible people who didn't agree. But we got them all together and said, well, what if it should happen? Everybody agreed that if it happened, it would be a catastrophe. So I talked this over carefully with President Reagan and with the members of Congress. And it was a funny thing about Reagan. He was a man of the outdoors. He had a ranch in California. He'd dig post holes, he'd cut the grass. He liked to do that. And he loved what he called the endless horizon. It was inspirational to him. And he didn't want anybody to mess up that environment. So he was very conscious. I used to be in the construction business. And you find construction guys, they're very appreciative of the environment because they're out there working in it all the time. So there's big arguments about what should happen. And these days, it seems to me, if there's somebody disagrees with you, you have a fight with them. You villainize them. He said, no. Let's just put our arm around them and say, okay, you have a different opinion. We respect that. But you do agree that if it happens, it would be a catastrophe. So why don't we take out an insurance policy? You don't take an insurance policy because you think your house is going to burn down. You take it in case it happens to you. You hope it doesn't. So that had an appeal. It didn't get the people who were opposed to join us, but it got them off our back. So we could move, and as so often happens, when it's clear in the United States that something important is up, the juices, the creative juices in this country are fabulous, and they kick in. And in this case, the DuPont company came up with something you could do. Not something you could aspire to by 2025, but something you could do today. And so we started getting people to do it. And in the lower income countries, we had a little extra money to help them get that done. And when the fix was all in, we had a big meeting in Montreal. And it became called the Montreal Protocol. President Reagan called it a magnificent achievement. It was easily ratified in the Senate. Even some of the people who voted against said that they would have voted for it if their vote were needed. So we had people on board, and it has worked. And in retrospect, I think I've heard lots of knowledgeable people say that it's clear that the scientists who were worried were right, and the Montreal Protocol came just in time. So I think somehow we have to learn how to convert this issue and other issues. And I know when I was in the national government, we had an important issue. We made a big effort to say, let's try to create this as a nonpartisan issue, not bipartisan, nonpartisan, and get people to look at it that way. And then you can begin to get someplace. And I think that something like this, that has such a profound effect, not only on us, but brothers and sisters throughout the world, we should be able to get a kind of nonpartisan consensus on the importance of working at it. You mentioned quite a few of the things that are happening, Jennifer, which I agree with. One that I've become very conscious of recently, we have at Stanford here a wonderful woman named Lucy Shapiro. She's a biologist. She's more fun, and my wife loves her. She says, I know you're a great scientist, Lucy, but you're a real woman. That's what I like. But Lucy is great. And she says, as the globe warms, tropical diseases will move north, and we're not ready. It's beginning to happen, have you noticed? So there are all kinds of effects here. This is a big, important problem, and we have to deal with it. And we know how. We can do it. I remember when we had, it was a big break, some Texas oil companies got up Proposition 23 in California that would have killed off our environmental efforts. And Tom Steyer and I were asked by the governor to lead a campaign, Democrat and a Republican. So what did? We got both candidates for governor, the Republican and the Democrat, to endorse our position. So we said, this isn't a partisan issue, this is a nonpartisan issue. And then we put it forward very powerfully, and we determined at the beginning, I remember he and I talked and said, we don't want to just win. We want to win big. We want to make a big impact that the people of California care about this. So we campaigned hard. Fortunately, we raised some money, but Tom had a little, so he was able to put in some. And so we were able, one of the things you have to do with these things is have early money, because then you can reserve TV time near the election. And if you don't do it early, you don't get it. So we were able to do that. And we won among men, among women, among every age group, among every ethnic group. We really swept the board. But the whole concept was, this is a nonpartisan effort to protect the California environment that we all care about. And it includes, our most effective ad was a woman that looked like your mother, who's head of the American Lung Association. And she said, watch out for the quality of the air you breathe, and that made a huge impact. So, that's all I have to say.
I want to talk about what a policy could look like that the next president might offer in a way that might gain acceptance across both parties. And full disclosure, I, like some in this room, am part of the Clinton team and helping to lead the energy policy group. So just to, I know there's a number of you who are in this, and fortunately you have a counterpart with Secretary Shultz for those who are in the other party. And good luck with Donald Trump. But anyway, okay. So what energy strategy should the next president adopt? So let me just ask you, because I know you're all super smart people, if you asked the public right now, and this is from, I'm going to show you the results of this from the Pew Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust does a survey every January of what the public's priorities are. What are the top priorities? Jobs, right? Right? Okay, so yeah. If you look at all of them, economy and jobs are near the top of the list, and if you look down at the bottom of the list, it's climate change. So the issue for us is, duh, if you're smart, you focus on jobs when you attack the issue of climate change. And so we've got this problem in Congress, right? Many of you have seen the polls that show that Congress is viewed worse than root canals, lice, colonoscopies, carnies. Now, who would be comparing Congress to carnies? Although with the next president, who knows? Anyway, traffic jams and Genghis Khan. Congress is viewed worse than Genghis Khan. At least Congress is viewed better than meth labs. They're actually viewed better than gonorrhea as well, but so maybe there's hope. And of course, Congress is going to remain divided. At least this is what most people have thought. I mean, you know, with Donald Trump, you're never quite sure exactly how that's going to play out. But most people say Congress is going to remain divided. The House of Representatives, because of the way it's configured, will likely remain red. The Senate will likely be able to be overtaken, I think, by Democrats. And most prognosticators are predicting that narrowly. And so given that Congress appears to be gridlocked, and may be gridlocked into the next administration, what can we do? Keep calm and go around. And by this, let me ask you a question. What was one of the Obama administration's most effective policies that caused massive change in states across the nation? Voluntary changes. Voluntary, don't say Obamacare, because that. Race to the top in education, which has gotten controversial over time. But my point in raising this is that Race to the Top was an initiative that put $3.4 billion on the table, and as a result, 48 states changed their high school standards to essentially give every child a college prep curriculum. That means 48 governors, Democrats, Republicans, went to 48 legislatures and got them to pass state legislation to raise their standards. So essentially what you did was to create national education policy, but going through the states. And so the question is there an opportunity for a new kind of federalism? Is there a way we can empower the states more? If we can have, in our terms, distributed policy, if you will, to be able to empower these states to move, and it requires a few carrots. So I say, respect the states, empower the govs and the mayors. You guys recognize him. And so I want to focus on, many people know that she has been talking about 500 million solar panels, and that's great. But I want to focus about this second bullet, which is the $60 billion challenge that Secretary Clinton is proposing to put out, if she becomes president, to states and local areas. $60 billion. Remember, the race to the top was $3.4 billion. This is a significant commitment. Why a challenge to the states? So as we've seen, you all know that energy policy requires state and federal partnership. Energy is done at PUCs, it's done at FERC, you require a joint, and if we wait for Congress to do all of the little bitty pieces related to national, federal, or federal energy policy, we would all be losing our hair, it will all be gray, we will never do it in our natural lives. So incentivizing the states is something that often Republicans like, because you're giving the states the authority to do stuff, and Democrats like, because you might end up with national energy policy. So what might a challenge to the states look like? You would say you'd have to go above and beyond. You'd have to, first of all, protect the Clean Power Plan, right? But if you're going to challenge the states, you want to go above and beyond the Clean Power Plan, because you're not going to reward states that are for doing something they're already required to do, right? And so it'd be in two parts. One part establishes some federal baseline, and the second part is more specific, related to each state, that focuses on jobs. So the federal baseline requirements would be a federal floor for states who are interested in competing. So if you want to access some of this money, you have to, for example, in the power sector, you've got to have strong renewable portfolio standards. These are all, this is just, I'm imagining what it might look like. I'm not going to say it has to be 30% or whatever, because some states like California are so far beyond the states that have no clean energy standards. So you'd have to have, that'd have to be figured out in the crafting of the challenge. But you do bonus consideration if the state has a carbon market, for example. You'd include some sort of energy storage and demand response piece of it. On the building sector, you would have requirement for robust energy efficiency standards. You might have decoupling. You might have a requirement that they adopt the latest building codes. You might have requirement for some kind of PACE or other energy efficiency standards. In the transportation sector, as a baseline to be able to compete, you might say you've got to have incentives for EV purchases like the ZEV states. You have to have incentives for charging stations, both in the state and maybe as a part of a national grid. You'd have fleet purchases of EVs. These, you might have a lot of other stuff too, but you might keep it simpler and just say you have to have these baseline things in the power, in the building, and in the transportation sector. And then part two, which I love, gets to the jobs part. So you incentivize states to do state-specific industrial clusters to build the products that will reduce our carbon, so that we're not getting them all from China and from other places. So really to have a Make It in America focus. So part two, you would focus on helping states or incentivizing them to create industrial clusters that are relevant to their own strengths. You would have the states, for example, do a kind of SWOT analysis on their economy. What is their resource base? What's their supply chain? What's their industrial base look like? What's their geography look like? What would they be successful at? What could they build on this suite of clean energy products out there, of which there are gajillions? What could they build that would make them irresistible for global companies to locate there and for their existing supply chain to expand? So you would want to make sure that states had an innovation ecosystem so that they were able to have a robust tech transfer like Stanford does, so that you can take ideas from lab to market. You might require that they have, incubators, and that the incubators are staged, et cetera. So you'd have some kind of innovation ecosystem to create an industrial cluster. You might incentivize them to do permit streamlining so that the bureaucracy and the soft costs associated with both building and installation are not making us uncompetitive like they are right now. So a state or a local government, you might pancake permitting, you might collapse permitting times, you'd still respect, of course, the need for the permit so that you could protect the environment, but you can do it in a much more efficient way, like they do in other countries. We could do a value stream mapping of taking the waste out of the permitting process system. This is something that Republicans love too. So you can incentivize streamlining of the bureaucracy. You could incentivize in the states the ability for them to adopt workforce development strategies that relate to the clusters that they want to build. And you could make sure you've got a robust access to capital system inside of the states. So you reward states that create a clean energy infrastructure bank, for example, or provide other access to capital mechanisms so that you can actually build the products and install them in the state. So you'd have innovation ecosystem, permit streamlining, workforce development, and access to capital as part of the creation of state-specific ecosystems related to products. Now, let me just talk about specifically what I mean here, because I have been leading a project at the Berkeley Energy and Climate Institute called the American Jobs Project, and our team, 3 members of our team are right here, Hank Love and Mary Collins and Kate Ringness. And what we have done through the American Jobs Project is to identify we just picked 10 swing states, 10 states that are purple, so that we didn't get accused of going one way or the other. And we said, what in those 10 states could those particular states select as their industrial clusters that would make sense for them? So we got an academic partner and partners on the ground in each of those states to be able to identify what works for them. So let me give you an example. Since we picked 10 states, we picked 2 technologies per state with our partners on the ground. It wouldn't be Berkeley going to North Carolina to say what your technologies are, because they would never listen to us, but they would listen to North Carolina State, and they would listen to the partners that are there. So, for example, let me give you an example of 3 states of what this might look like. 3 states, Michigan, Virginia, and North Carolina. So in North Carolina, working with the folks on the ground, they said, we could really be great at utility-scale batteries and biogas. Why? Utility-scale batteries, they have a great anchor company called Alivo there, and they also have the North Carolina Research Triangle, which is working on a lot of smart grid stuff. So they said, we want to really focus on how can we be the go-to state to build utility-scale batteries. And biogas, why? Because North Carolina is what, the 2nd largest state, or the 1st largest state in swine and poultry farming, and we don't have a whole lot of anaerobic digester manufacturers in the United States. And so why not have the state that has all of that resource be the go-to state for it? So utility scale batteries, you've got a whole supply chain that's a possibility. You don't want to just assemble the batteries. You want to make sure you have, the anode, the cathode, the separator material, the electrolyte. You want it all to be in North Carolina for that particular product, so you've got a whole supply chain there, which creates jobs. And we went through and we identified policy recommendations to be able to create these clusters. This is one of 16, just a quick sample that North Carolina would need to enhance or might consider enhancing their cost recovery for utilities by enabling a leasing model for pilot storage projects on the utility side. Same thing with biogas. You can see there's all sorts of potential jobs in the supply chain of an anaerobic digester. All of those businesses could be made in North Carolina. The farmers love it. They want to be able to install these. They want to be able to draw the energy, the methane from the biogas. And a sample policy recommendation would be to allow third-party sales of biogas generated electricity, which they don't have now. This is one of 16. In Virginia, Virginia's 2 technologies were composite materials and offshore wind. Could be creating 19,000 jobs per year. We know the composite material demand side is going through the roof. Lightweight materials, strong materials for energy efficiency and for products like vehicles, et cetera, that are lightweight. A sample recommendation of policy, 1 of 25 for this, would be updating the machine and tools tax inside of North Carolina to exempt the equipment that is used directly in producing energy efficient products. Same thing, offshore wind. There was a bipartisan consensus in Virginia about how important it would be to do offshore wind right off the Atlantic. They've been working with their utilities, et cetera. What if they build the turbines? What does it look like to have to build those massive offshore wind turbines? How could Virginia benefit from that? One of the recommendations is to prepare their ports to meet the needs of the supply chain with funds from their transportation infrastructure bank. In Virginia, the composite material play also benefits because Tennessee has just been designated by DOE as one of the Make It in America centers for advanced composites. So there is a regional play for them to be able to create jobs as well. And quickly in Michigan, the two industrial clusters were smart buildings and solar. Smart buildings because Michigan has a huge technology center related to the auto industry and a huge appliance and building sector as well, and solar, lots of glass from the auto industry as well. 12,000 jobs per year if they pass the right policies. The building sector has huge amount of supply chain. There's so much that goes into a building sector, it's hard to even know where to start. The policy allow on-bill financing for energy efficiency improvement that pulls demand for the products that they don't currently have. Solar, again, that upper left-hand picture is a panel that was painted with organic solar paint. That was from Michigan, but obviously lots of advances in solar, and they need to raise the caps on solar net metering as one of 15 policies in Michigan. Bottom line is, we picked specific policies for that particular state to be able to create these industrial clusters, but you can see 19,000 jobs in North Carolina, 19 in Virginia, 12 in Michigan, 11, 6 in Pennsylvania, Ohio. Each of them have their own clusters too. Georgia 24, Florida 98, Iowa, Colorado, Nevada. Bottom line, just from 2 clusters per year in just 10 states, 250,000 jobs per year. That's something that people can agree on. Let's build the products here instead of assuming that they're going to be built somewhere else, but you have to have the policies that make the products competitive in the United States. So the question for us is, what might the whole strategy look like if you can get $60 billion from Congress? And if you can't get $60 billion from Congress to challenge the states, you might have a private sector challenge to Congress to be able to get to a number that is robust enough that would make the governors jump. And believe me, they would totally, I know them, they would totally jump at this. Using a bottom-up strategy that induces states and cities, you don't want to forget cities and regions, to go beyond the Clean Power Plan, establishing a federal floor in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and transportation, extra reward for the boldest states, incentivize the stragglers, focus on building these state-specific industrial clusters, which are jobs, leverage the Make It in America centers and create more of them, all to create jobs, jobs, jobs. So who can create good-paying advanced manufacturing jobs? Who can convince the states to adopt clean energy policies? Who can save our planet from death and destruction? Is it George Shultz? Is it John Podesta? Or is it, in fact, our next president, whoever she is? That's it.
And I'm just going to ask Governor Granholm and Secretary Shultz to continue the dialogue a little bit. I think both of you talked about, frankly, the need to depoliticize the clean energy economy, the pivot to clean energy economy, the climate change issue. What's the best way to do that? And particularly when we still have a lot of climate skeptics out there who want to deny climate change. What could the next president do as a leader? What should others in this room be doing to help depoliticize this issue? And is it important to depoliticize it? Let's start with you, Jennifer.
I mean, I appreciate what you said about not being bipartisan, being nonpartisan. And in every state, every mayor and every governor are focused on jobs. And to me, I don't want to skirt the issue of climate change, but I feel like I want to say, you know, agree or disagree, you all want jobs. And if you are putting your green eye shade on as a business person and you are looking at the demand trajectory of these products, you want to have those products built in your state. And if you aren't following the fact that the globe is going to have a huge demand for batteries, for smart buildings, for, you know, all of this, then you're missing the boat. So I would say, you know, regardless of what you think about whether the climate is warming, you have to acknowledge the facts that the demand for these products is going through the roof. And the question is, are we going to be passive and allow other countries to achieve to get those businesses to locate there, or are we going to get in the game? And I say, let's get in the game.
Secretary.
Well, you have to face the fact that a lot of people now work in coal mines and various other efforts at fossil fuels. That's a large employer. And so you got to think about those jobs.
For sure.
I think the effort to say, put a price out there instead of telling people you can't do this and that, says to them, look, maybe you can figure out how you can make coal usable. We do know that you can capture and sequester. It's expensive. Well, if you can figure out a way to do it, fine. You can save your job. But we have to realize that there are winners, but there are also losers, and deal with them, because that's part of your politics.
The way you do this is to get more George Shultz's in the Republican Party. Really, we need more of you to be able to make the case. I mean, you are such a fantastic, you know, leader on this, and I just wish there were more of you who are willing to stand up and say, put a price on carbon, and the economists say this is the most efficient way of being able to do that. But alas, you are sort of alone.
Well, people keep saying that, but I say, who was the first big environmentalist? Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
Who created the EPA? Richard Nixon. Who did the acid rain cap and trade system? George H.W. Bush. Who did the Montreal Protocol? Ronald Reagan. What more do I have to say?
I hate to say that you're, of course.
So let me follow up on this. Secretary Shultz, you make an important point that there are winners and losers. And one of the things that's interesting is that our energy use as a country is not going up. It's staying steady, and renewables are only 10% right now of our energy, and fossil fuels are the great majority of them. If we're moving away, there are going to be winners and losers in that space. So how do we deal with that? And a second question.
One way we deal with that is what Jim Sweeney will teach us. And when his book comes out, when is it going to be, Jim? About August.
What's it called?
Wait
What's
for
the
this
name?
book.
What's the title of it?
It's called Energy Efficiency, Building a Clean, Secure Economy. Got all three in there.
Awesome.
But what this book does is it tells you, and we put in color charts so you can easily read the charts, how much has been contributed to solving our problem by using energy more efficiently. It's huge. It dwarfs everything. And more of it can be done.
Right. So your point maybe is that it's not just a question of jobs in the sources of energy, but also in the application of energy. And how we use our energy may be a huge new opening for new jobs that we haven't thought about. And you're seeing a lot of that interest here in Silicon Valley with the behind-the-meter activity, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But
Let me give you an example. I used to work up in the city. I worked at a company called Bechtel. And we had a 23-story building. And you remember 10 or 12 years ago, there was a big electricity crisis in California. And so we dimmed the lights in the corridors, actually made them better. They weren't so glary. And it's a company where people travel a lot, so the word went out, if somebody's not coming into the office, don't turn the lights on. So we saved 13% of our electricity.
Right.
Nobody invented anything, nobody was put out, just did some sensible things because you're a little conscious. Mm-hmm. And huge amounts can be saved this way. Huge.
And I would say that the combination of hardware and software put together is an opportunity for the U.S. to vie for manufacturing those products, because you will need the research and development adjacent, perhaps, to the manufacturing, that you will need an ecosystem of suppliers, that there is, when you have a building that can sense when you are entering, or if you have a building where your ions are being negotiated with your storage, it's so much more complex than a one-off product that is simply manufactured somewhere else. So I just get back to the jobs point about, I think so strongly that politicians on both sides of the aisle are all interested in jobs. And if the business community can help give them the backbone to be able to pass laws, because it's good for business, because business needs to adapt to this both globally and regionally, then I think it can happen.
So let me ask both of you who have had extraordinary experience in government, if you were the next president, how would you set up the federal government for success here? What we're hearing is that a lot of the action is at the state level. We've got a skeptical Congress. We've got to bring along and sort of prove the case that we can move out together as a country. But it's going to take the business community. It's going to take stakeholder groups of all types. It's going to take state and local government working with federal government. And in the federal government alone, you've got so many cabinet agencies that have a stake in all this. How do you implement at the federal level this kind of transformative activity, and how can the president oversee that effectively? It seems like, an incredible challenge.
I'll tell you how you do it.
Okay.
You go back to doing things the old-fashioned way. Right now, if you are asked to be assistant secretary or something, and you say yes, you get a wad of paper about this thick, and you realize you have to have an accountant and a lawyer to help you through, and somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, by the way, if there's a mistake, it's a criminal penalty. So finally you get that in, and you get nominated. The Senate then takes its time. Then you get reported out favorably. At the end of the 2014 Congress, there were 133 people who had been reported out favorably and not acted upon by the Senate. In other words, those are all empty slots. And you can't run things that way. Furthermore, there has been a huge movement of policy setting and execution into the White House and the NSC. Bob Gates in his book says, I was in Afghanistan, I saw this white telephone, I picked it up, it's connected to some kid in the White House. He says, I ripped it out and threw it at somebody. You can't run things that way. So here's what should be done. The president-elect should say, I am going to regard my cabinet and sub-cabinet as my staff. And those are the people I'm going to work with to develop policy. It'll be my policy, but they're going to be involved. When you do it that way, you have access to the career people. And I found in the various cabinets I headed, the career people will work with you if you work with them. And they have a lot to contribute. They've been there, they understand where the bodies are buried. They can be extremely helpful. So you get better policies that way, and you get involvement. And so that when it comes to execution, there are people a little closer to it that can do the execution. So you get better quality across the board that way. And you need to say then to everybody, there's some cross-current type subjects, and energy is one of them. Everybody touches it in some fashion or another. And let's get it on our minds. The DOD uses a huge amount of energy. The Navy has been particularly pushing on this. And I have a big thing in my office, what Marines wear these days in Afghanistan. It's got a flap on the back. It's a solar panel. So instead of carrying all kinds of batteries, they have that little flap on their back, and they stick it in the sunshine once in a while, and they charge everything up. There are all kinds of things you can do, and all departments can do those things. And you get the A players with this kind of approach. And you also can go to the Congress and say, the Senate, and say, This is the way I'm governing. These are the people who can be called to testify at any time. They're accountable government. So I want a prompt up or down vote on every nominee. And I expect to have the benefit of the doubt because these are the people I plan to work with.
Great. Jennifer?
Just to build on that a little bit, I think I hear what you're saying. I do think that the White House has to be the locus for the energy strategy in the sense that they've got to be the convener. Because if you hand it to just DOE, then there's interagency, I think, competition. So there has to be the president or their designee as some sort of, I don't know, I hate to use the word czar too, but some super person with a Superman, but some person who is able to pull in the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy and the Navy and, all of the agencies who have some touch on it, because almost commerce, they all have some kind of touch. So there has to be sort of an energy cabal, cabinet, whatever it is, from where the policy goes out, but it's organized in a cohesive way.
Great.
I had an experience way back in 1969. I was Secretary of Labor, and the President made me chairman of a cabinet task force on the oil import program. President Eisenhower had thought that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we use, we were asking for trouble in national security terms. We're beginning to bump up against that. That's why the task force. So we put together a good task force, and inside of a week, we knew more about the subject than anybody else in the federal government. So one of our recommendations was, this energy is an important strategic subject. There ought to be somebody permanently in this government that's paying attention. And we had a number of other recommendations, as obvious as that one. Nothing was done. Congressional hearings, a report was published. The president patted me on the head, thank nice. But then when the 73 Arab oil boycott broke out, and suddenly there was an event, all these recommendations got put into effect.
Yeah.
And so somehow you've got to be ready to take advantage of events that come along that give you a chance.
And now might be a time.
Totally agree with that.
So let's thank Governor Granholm and Secretary Shultz.
Thanks, everybody.